One of the most special video game experiences to me is that of the final boss. The final obstacle standing between you and your destination, an enemy that has been waiting for you to complete your journey. Every action you've taken, every item you've collected, every level you've gained, every objective you've completed has all led to this enemy. If the game devs have done their job correctly, the final boss stands as a final test of all the skills you've accumulated over the course of the campaign. There are countless antagonists in gaming history that fit this bill, but still don't end up being recounted on anyone's most memorable lists. That could be for any number of reasons, from the fight being lackluster or a series of QuickTime events, to the antagonist not being properly built up in relation to the campaign itself, or the game just being kind of meh. However, I think there's a piece of the final boss puzzle that most people either take for granted or overlook entirely, and that's the music. When used properly, music alone can establish the tone and atmosphere of any given scene. When it's at its most effective, music tells us how to feel in a given situation without the need for characters to spout exposition. Humans are wonderful at interpreting musical cues and responding accordingly. When a character dies, the music often reflects the sadness of that moment. Even if you weren't paying attention, the music would inform you of the tone. You wouldn't need a character to feel, "I feel sad," or "this is a bad moment," to understand what was going on. This holds true for television, movies, and yes, video games. At its worst, bad music in a boss battle can pull you out of the moment and detract from the fight itself. At its best, it can add another layer of thematic depth and payoff to the conflict you're struggling through. There are plenty of good examples of final boss fights with music that enhances the confrontation, like the One-Winged Angel during Sephiroth's battle in Final Fantasy VII. The final battle against Ganon in Ocarina of Time. Or Trainer Red's theme in the Pokemon series. But for me, there's one example that stands as my personal favorite. The music combined with the battle itself elevates the experience to a completely different level, but that's not to say it's the absolute best example out there. As the title of this video has already given away, I'm referring to the Soul of Cinder's battle and the music from Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls has no shortage of fantastic music, with two of my favorites being the theme going into Ornstein and Smoug's fight from Dark Souls 1, and both iterations of Gundir's theme from Dark Souls 3. While both tunes certainly ground me in the moment and increase my immersion, they don't hit me on the same thematic or emotional note as Soul of Cinder. To understand why, we have to take a step back and have a brief look at the Souls game both in terms of lore and gameplay mechanics. The stories of these games center around the idea of cycles, history repeating itself endlessly under different but viciously similar circumstances. At the center of this cycle are two things, the first flame and the curse of the undead, tethered together eternally. The first flame brought light to the world and led to an age of fire, an era where progress was made in the world and kingdoms rose. However, as time marched on, the first flame began to fade, and with that came the curse of the undead. This curse prevented mankind from dying, instead slowly losing their humanity until they became empty, mindless vessels known as hollows or undead. It was discovered that the only way to rekindle the first flame was to sacrifice a powerful soul to it, thus starting a new era in the Age of Fire and creating a new period without the undead curse. The first to undertake the task of rekindling the flame was a king named Gwyn, who also serves as the final boss of Dark Souls 1. One of the biggest selling points of the franchise is its perceived difficulty and the ability to craft your character's build to suit your personal playstyle. You've got strength builds, dexterity builds, sorcery builds, faith builds, pyro builds, or hybrids of any of the above. Whether you like to crush your opponents with massive weapons, finesse them with fast striking weapons, or cheese them from a distance with range tactics, there's a character build just for you. The games give you all the tools you need to approach any of these obstacles. The Souls games certainly know how to bear their fangs in terms of difficulty and can frustrate even the best of us, but that is what ultimately allows most players to eventually conquer their foes. As you're faced with harder and harder obstacles to overcome, it falls squarely on the player's shoulders to compensate by increasing their own skill level. Sometimes that takes the form of getting better at choosing equipment or allocating stat points to exactly where you need them. Sometimes it takes the form of getting better at reading enemy attack patterns or bolstering your reaction time. You begin to understand that the game isn't unnecessarily hard or cheap, but that perhaps there were errors in your tactics, and you work to close those gaps in your defense. Each death, while frustrating, begins to show you that you're being punished for a mistake that you made. In turn, you rise to meet the challenge before you, and it becomes strength through hardship. That strength and knowledge carries over from game to game, and eventually, after 3 long journeys, you arrive at the end of Dark Souls 3. Now you're walking up to the kiln of the first flame, to clash with the final boss, the last being that stands in your way. You gather your resolve and approach the entity waiting for you in a graveyard of swords and ash. Once it acknowledges your presence, the battle begins and its name appears. At first, I didn't think anything of its name, the Soul of Cinder. Up until that point in Dark Souls 3, you'd been hunting and killing Lords of Cinder, so the first clue of what I was up against admittedly went right over my head. The music during the first phase of this fight is about what I'd expect from the final boss, getting my blood pumping and focusing all of my attention on my enemy like a laser. When the fighting began, I did what I always did. It took some time to get a feel for his attack patterns and movements. Once I felt confident, I began chipping away at his HP. But then something peculiar happened. In an instant, the Soul of Cinder altered its weapon and all of its attack patterns. The change caught me completely off guard, but I kept fighting as efficiently as I could. And then it happened again. It took me a moment to realize what was happening, but eventually I caught on that the Soul of Cinder was cycling through all of the fighting styles of the major character builds I mentioned earlier. The match began to feel less and less like a boss fight, and more like a struggle against another player. It wasn't until it returned to the beginning of its cycle that I realized the Soul of Cinder hadn't used any lightning-based attacks, which fall under the spell category of miracles. I thought it was a very strange oversight to leave out one of the major character builds when the Soul of Cinder had clearly demonstrated it was capable of everything else. I decided it was a small detail and just kept fighting. I took a swing at the Soul of Cinder and reduced its HP to 0, but I had a feeling there would be a second phase. The Soul of Cinder takes a moment to compose itself and initiate the second half of this finale, but as it does, the music reached a crescendo, and then... when the notes hit my ears, I froze. A surge of nostalgia swept through me, and at the same time, the Soul of Cinder switched his battle tactics once again. Not only did it end up using another weapon, it also brandished lightning-based attacks. The music alongside the distinct fighting style was parallel to the final boss of the first Dark Souls game, the one who initially linked the first flame, Lord Gwyn. And just like that, all of the thematic pieces of the fight clicked into place. The name of this particular opponent, the switch of its combat styles, and the placement of the music during the second phase, it all made sense. Now, I'm no Vati Vidya, so it took the musical cue for me to connect the dots. It was why the fight felt personal, like I was up against another player. It was why every fighting style and spell type was being thrown at me to prevent me from making it to the first flame. The Soul of Cinder was an amalgamation of every single soul that succeeded in linking the first flame. This last enemy stood as a mirror being held up to the player, a reflection of all of those that survived the same obstacles as us. The Soul of Cinder was a physical manifestation of the very cycle we were fighting against. With everything suddenly clear as day, my appreciation for the conflict I was locked in deepened considerably. The music went from being a track trying to remind me of the caliber of the enemy I was up against, to a melancholy tune leaning heavily into the piano melody from Gwyn's fight that stirred up years of nostalgia. Between the piano and the beautiful string instruments supplementing it, I couldn't help but reflect on all the struggles I endured while playing through the Souls games, reminding me of the way I felt when I stood against Gwyn for the very first time. The masterful implementation of Gwyn's theme into the finale of Dark Souls 3 took what might very well be just an average boss fight and elevated it. In terms of difficulty, it's a very middle-of-the-pack encounter. Plenty of bosses in the franchise outshine the Soul of Cinder on the difficulty scale, but none of them made me feel anything other than the frustrating lows of defeat or the satisfying highs of victory. Sure, there were times when I'd stop and say, wow, this is a really good tune, but then I'd immediately put it out of mind and focus on the fight. With the Soul of Cinder, the music stopped me dead at the onset of Phase 2. I found myself getting distracted by the haunting keys, which led me to taking damage I could have avoided had I not been lost in thought. For someone that has played these games one after another, it's a wonderful moment that forces you down memory lane. It forces you to reconsider everything you've seen, read, or heard from NPCs. The song beautifully ties the universe together and emphasizes the theme of the endless cycle that is the Age of Fire one last time. When the battle ended, I felt sad in a way. For the first time, I didn't just feel like I'd beaten the final boss. I felt like I'd honestly and truly reached the end of a long journey. An incredible number of emotions were stirring inside me, and I guess I wasn't the only one. I was listening to the track on YouTube, and the comments section is filled with people who seem to have the same emotional response that I did. It's a powerful reminder of just how potent well-placed music can be. I'm sure I'm going to butcher these names, but we have Yuka Kitamura, and to an extent Motoi Sakuraba, to thank for this beautiful piece of music. Motoi was the original composer for Gwen's theme way back in Dark Souls 1, and Yuka is responsible for the Soul of Cinder iteration, skillfully weaving it into something of her own while respecting her colleague's original theme. It can be easy to judge a boss encounter by its individual pieces rather than the cohesive whole. It can be easy to overlook truly wonderful components by focusing on aspects that you felt were poorly executed or just downright hate. While I don't foresee Soul of Cinder winning any popularity contests on its own, I think that when you take a step back and look at the complete package and what it means not only for the franchise lore, but also what it means to you, you'll see there's truly something special waiting for you at the kiln of the first flame. Thanks for watching.